Hi guys, so welcome to the second lecture of Chapter 2. This is going to go over studying climate change. First, we'll be talking about how we studied climate change extending back into the ancient past with proxy indicators. Then we're going to be talking a little bit about how we've studied and understood climate change in the modern context over the last couple of decades. And then finally, we'll be going over climate models, which allows us to project and look at the effects of climate change long-term into the future. So in order to look at how climate behaved and interacted with the solid environment in the ancient past, we look at something called proxy indicators. Basically, scientists don't have direct data to measure the climate levels throughout all of time because humans didn't exist or have that technology until around the 1900s. So instead, we had to rely on indirect evidence to compare the current climates to past or ancient climates. And we do that using something called proxy indicators. Proxy indicators simply refer to types of indirect evidence that scientists use to help determine the magnitude and the timeline of climate change. Basically, we use proxy indicators to look at what climate was like in the ancient past and how it has changed over time before we actually had the technology or resources to physically observe it. And we have three basic proxy indicators that we rely on. The first are ice cores, which are the predominant source of proxy indicators that we use to estimate what climate was like. Then we use sediment cores, and finally we use other indicators such as tree rings, mudflats, or coral reefs. Now, ice cores are the predominant source of proxy indicators that we use to estimate the climates of the ancient past. And basically all ice cores are cores of ice, very long cylinders of ice with many tiny bubbles trapped inside of them. And these ice caps or these tiny bubbles contain the gas concentrations from the ancient climates of Earth's past. Basically, every time one of these bubbles was frozen in time, it is basically a snapshot of the ambient climate conditions, so the concentrations of CO2, of oxygen, of nitrogen, any gas that is present in the atmosphere at that time is trapped in those ice bubbles and allows us to put together a timeline of how the Earth's climate has changed or how the concentrations of greenhouse gases and other gases has changed going back millions and millions of years. So this allows scientists to simply evaluate how much carbon dioxide was present in the distant past versus how much carbon dioxide is present now. And that's how we have basically established that the concentrations of carbon dioxide now are the highest that we've seen in around 80,000 years because we are relying again on those ice cores. Other proxy indicators include something called sediment cores. And sediment cores are basically long cylinders or cores of dirt from the distant past which contain pollen and other indirect evidence of plant life. Now remember that plants can only grow in certain types of climates and certain types of precipitation and temperature ranges. So when we look at the pollen trapped inside these sediment cores, we can look at what types of plants existed in that given location as the climate changed through time. So it gives an indirect evidence based on ecosystems of what climates existed in a given location as we look through time back millions and millions of years. Finally, we look at growth indicators. And growth indicators are that final category of miscellaneous indicators, specifically looking at tree rings and mudflaps. Basically, trees can only exist in very specific climates. Same with coral reefs. They can only exist in very specific climates. And simply their occurrence in time provides evidence over what climates existed where and over what time periods. Now, in good conditions, tree rings and coral reefs grow very, very quickly. So if we look at per unit time, so at the width of the tree rings or the length of the coral polyp nodes, we can determine how much CO2 was in the area. So if in very warm, very supportive climates, we would see very large tree rings or very wide spans between polyps and coral reefs, indicating that these temperatures were a lot warmer, a lot more hospitable to that life. However, in bad conditions, areas with cold temperatures and lower CO would lead to slower growth, so narrower bands in the rungs of trees and narrower polyp nodes between different generations of polyps, indicating that there was less CO2 in colder conditions in those environments. Now, in addition to proxy indicators, we also have direct measurements in which we can document daily fluctuations in variables like temperature, rainfall, wind intensity, air pressure, and sea level. And by comparing direct measurements to these proxy indicators giving us data from the distant past, we can readily compare how the climate has been changing through time. Now, we started measuring through direct measurements ocean and atmospheric chemistry in around 1958 at the Mauna Loa Observatory, and data from the Mauna Loa Observatory shows direct evidence of increased concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, as well as increases in temperature and increases in sea level rise. So even in the 60 or 70 years that we have data on the direct measurements, we are seeing pronounced increases in atmospheric CO2 as well as notable climate notable increases in different climate variables. However, when we compare those increases to what we have seen over the past few millions of years, we see drastic increases in carbon dioxide as evidenced by the graph on the top left of your corner. So when we put these different pieces of evidence together, we can develop a more holistic picture and see the drastic increase in both temperature as well as carbon dioxide, as well as some of these other climate variables, which are drastically increasing in their intensity and severity as we move forward in time compared to thousands of years ago. Now, in addition to proxy indicators and direct evidence, we also rely on what are called climate models or simulations, which allow us to look forward in time and estimate the effects of climate change on future climates. Basically, climate models combine data and simulate climate processes to make predictions about the future. So essentially, climate models basically take proxy indicators, data from proxy indicators, and direct evidence in concert with our current understanding of Earth's systems and cycles, things such as atmospheric conditions, ocean circulation, the interplay between the oceans and the atmosphere, and then different positive and negative feedback cycles to estimate what the climates are going to be like in the near and the distant future if our patterns of consumption and emissions on carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases don't change. And to give you an idea of what that looks like, here's a graph of the 2010 warming predictions based on emissions and the expected warming based on pledges and current policies. Now, it should note that a lot of climate deniers like to point out different models and variations in different models as debate or inconsistencies within the science. And essentially, this isn't really necessarily the case. Much of the variation in models comes from predictions based on human behavior. What we do dictates what the model will project. So most of the baseline warming, if our patterns and behaviors don't change, is going to be what you see in gray. If current policies such as the Paris Accords or different climate policies curbing emissions are implemented and consistent, you see something like the current policies trend in blue. Opportunistic or optimistic policies, things that we should implement that are recommended by different climate agencies and authorities, are what you see somewhere in orange, and then other pledges and targets or keeping CO2 emissions consistent as is result in lower and lower changes in ambient temperature as we adjust our conditions to those models. Note that the green and the yellow, basically consistent conditions, are those that if we don't change and we stop adding CO2 altogether, the climate will still increase by about 2 degrees Celsius, which is substantial. So if we want to contain the effects of climate change, we really have to act now in order to limit the amount of CO2 that we continue to add into the atmosphere. Now, it should be noted which agencies or which international agencies actually monitor these climate policies and are responsible for including and projecting these models. Basically, the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is an international group of scientists which periodically releases reports on the state of global climate change in enormous detail. Now, these discusses things like the causes of climate change, which has been almost unilaterally human-induced causes, basically the anthropogenic induction or intensification of the greenhouse gas effect. It then projects those future trends in climate change that we just talked about, and then it projects several different impacts. The impacts are something that we're going to go over in the next lecture. Things such as sea level and temperature rise, social impacts, basically the disruption of social patterns or human patterns across the globe, and the severe implications in biodiversity. So these are all going to be serious challenges, and it basically highlights the need to curtail some of these CO2 emissions to avoid some of these most problematic and most severe impact scenarios that are projected by the IPCC in these different climate reports. Now, that is all that we have today for the studying climate change. Next, we're going to actually dive into some of the details of the IPCC's projected impacts, looking at the sea level and temperature rise, storm frequency and intensity, biodiversity loss, and social change, all of which are projected and predicted in the latest annual report.